Okay, Boker Tov. Today's daf is daf Yud, and we pick up with the Mishnah. And this is a Mishnah that is a sort of famous Mishnah, not so much related to Hagigah really at all, except that it's mentioned in one sort of little section of it, and sort of gets the Masechet into some much sort of broader type of discussions, both in this parak and as we'll see in the next one. So let's take a look. Heter Nidarim, Porchim Ba'avir. The ability to annul vows, the Torah allows for a woman's father or husband to annul the vow, but the idea that somebody who makes any vow can go to a sage and explain why, had they realized certain things, they never would have made the vow, etc., and then the sage can annul it. So that really is seems to be coming out of nowhere, as we would say. So the Mishnah says it flies in the air. It does not have something to support itself on. Does not have any real verse, any real thing in the Torah to support itself on, right? So I guess to keep the metaphor, to be somech is to be sort of to physically rest on something, have something support you. So this is flying in the air without support. It has nothing to ground it. Hilchos Shabbos Chagigot v'Hami'ilot, and here's why we're mentioning it here, because of the word Hagigah. Again, why of all places, if anything, this probably should have been in Nidarim, but okay. I mean, there is a cross reference there in Nazi, but anyway, okay. Hagigah gets mentioned here. The laws of Shabbos, the laws of Chagigot, what we're talking with the holiday sacrifices, the yontif sacrifices, and laws of Mi'ilah, harehem keharim hatluyim b'se'ara. Those are like mountains supported on a hair. Shehein mikra murat 1 minute v'hilchot merubot. That it's not like Heter Nidarim where there's no verse. There is a little verse, right? There are some verses, but based on the tiny little verse, you have a huge mountain. You have many halachot. So these huge mountains are being somehow suspended with a hair. So it's better than no support, I suppose, but it is being but only with a hair. And of course, it's a little funny. Shabbos, you understand, are halachot merubot. How many halachas are there in Hagigah? I mean, we've done one parak, hasn't been so many halachas. So anyway, Me'ilah is huge, of course, based on very little verses. No, not that it's not mentioned. The difference between Nidarim and these three is that Nidarim basically have no mention. These have a tiny mention, a hair's breadth that supports them, but the amount of halachot that we have for them is huge. It's like a mountain. Well, all right, so we'll look at the Gemara. Okay. Hadinim v'havodot, so like civil laws, and avodot, presumably laws of the service in the temple, v'hataharot, and tahara, v'hatmeot, and tuma, v'arayot, and forbidden sexual acts. Those have real things to support themselves on. So you have Heter Nidarim don't have Amashi Yismachu. The last set have Amashi Yismachu, are like very well, clearly based on biblical verse, and the middle stuff is a tiny little thing that you have a huge mountain sort of suspended in midair. The Hein Gufei Torah, and they are the essence of the Torah. Now, the way it's read here, it sounds like these last things are the essence of the Torah, and the earlier things are not. So the Gemara switches the girsa to Hein Vehein Gufei Torah. These and they, meaning whether the stuff in the last group that are clearly based on clear sort of support in biblical verse, whether the stuff in the first group that seems to have no support in biblical verse, it's all equally Torah, no matter how much or little it is supported by the biblical verses. Okay, that's how the Gemara will read it. Let's take a look at the Gemara. Tanya, we turn to Brisa. Rabbi Linzer Omer, Yesh lehem mamash yismachu. So there's a pushback. How can you say that there's no verse based for Heter Nidarim? Of course there's something to rely on. Might be a hair, but there's something to rely on. Shenemar, as the verse says, Ki afli, if somebody enunciates lindur neder nazir, that's by nazirut, lazir lashem, or ki afli, it's a second time ki afli, neder be'erkecha. So the word yafli is sort of like to enunciate. It specifically refers to a speech act where where saying something creates is considered like a legal act and creates a reality. Anyway, that's used by a neder and it's used by nazir. Shtei pamim. So why does it twice say it? And hafla here mean like to enunciate, or to say clearly, to tell you that the same way you can do you can enunciate and create prohibitions by making a neder, there could be an act of enunciation that annuls it, and that is the source of a heter nidarim. Okay, of course, it's pretty weak. So I understand. So is that a hair's breadth, or is that really nothing? He at least thought it was a hair. Okay, so Rabbi Yoshua Omer Yesh Mamash Yismus. No, I'll show you where they have some support. Shenemar, the verse says, Asher Nishpati Bi'apiv Pasuk in Tehillim Yim Yivon Amruchati. Right. So I swore in my anger. The Api Nishparti. So yes, I swore in my anger. But v'chazarti bi, since it was only a swearing in my anger, it was not, it was something that I could retract later on. It was not somehow fully binding. Okay, so what? Well, that's the problem. So Tosfos discusses that. Okay, yes.
So I don't know if you want to talk about this at all, but really, what does this mean about the concept of Torah Sheba'al Peh? In other words,
well, that's obviously why it's being put out there, is to speak about that and the Torah, that the sort of authority of Torah Sheba'al Peh is that some things really are just pure tradition and it's not based on a verse, and some things are more like the last category stuff that we could normally we could accept Torah Sheba'al Peh. You have Parshas Mishpatim, it's very clear you have all the laws, but anybody would look at it and say, okay, but like the details aren't figured out, like what exactly is a kikach, or like obviously you might have a certain degree of specificity, but obviously there's a lot of ambiguity. So okay, I could understand that you need either an oral tradition that has traditions of what that means, or you need an authoritative body to interpret some of those gray areas. That's the last stuff. But the two earlier categories are very questionable. Where are they coming from? It seems like they're making this stuff up, right? So that's exactly the point of the Mishnah, to say that it's all equally, central. It's all equally Torah.
I don't see that there is any less detail, let's say, than some of the examples that might be in this.
Well, we'll see.
About
all right, so we'll see. We'll see what the Gemara says about these things. Okay, but Heter Nedarim, certainly, all the psukim by Heter Nedarim sound like, without the exception when the husband annuls it, if you make the vow, you're bound by it. There's not a hint in the verse that there would be anything that could get you out of your vow. And the rabbis are saying there is. Okay, and that's not only is there like not a hint for it, there's like the whole sort of sense of the psukim is that there's no option, right? You're completely bound by your vow. Yes.
So based on this, can a chacham be made for his own neder? Because just like Hakadosh Baruch Hu is made for his own.
Yeah. Well. Okay. Yeah. Right. No, we don't say that.
Okay.
Well, Tosfos anyway says, what do you mean? It's Yimivona Menuchasi, and they weren't Baal Menuchasi. They didn't come to Eretz Yisrael. So what's that a basis for? So Tosfos says, well, maybe it means not literally the Menucha of Eretz Yisrael. Maybe it means Olam Haba, and it's a question whether Dor HaMidbar have. All right. So Tosfos deals with that. Now you see why it's debated whether it really has anything to rely on. Okay. Anyway, but that shows you an idea that something made in anger, made not in a right state of mind, maybe is questionable. Again, of course, as everybody here is saying, is that if anything, maybe it says the opposite. Even if it's made in anger, you're bound by it. Okay. It has what to rely on. Shneamar, the verse says, Kol nadiv libo, anybody of generosity of heart, right, shall go, and sort of, brings the what they vowed to the temple, hiviyu, etc. So only if your heart remains sort of together with you, like you maintain that sort of commitment in the heart, are you still bound by it? Again, that's pretty weak. Okay, Hananiah ben Achi Rabbi Yoshua Omer. This is interesting. Hananiah, the son of the brother of Rabbi Yoshua, said, "Yesh mamashi yismachu shenemar nishpati ve'akaymena lishmor mishpatei tzidkecha." I have sworn, and I will fulfill to observe, your the rule, your righteous rules. Now, where do you see an idea of Heter Nedarim? Because you see, you need a second commitment ve'akaymena. It's not even though it's nishpati, I still need to be committed to akaymena, meaning that presumably hinting to the idea that there might be an option to say nishpati below akaymena. Okay, now of course we would say that option would be if you're violating, if you're not doing your obligations, but it hints to the idea that there's an alternative. I'm a Rabbi Yehuda, so it's a pretty question whether you consider this, the debate is this a hair or is this even nothing? I'm a Rabbi Yehuda, I'm a Shmuel, so Rabbi Yehuda now said the name of Shmuel, Yihavei Hassam, if I were there, Amri Lehu Didi Adifam B'ditchu, I would have said something better than all of them. Shneamar, my thing is better than theirs. Because the verse says, and this verse is the one that's always quoted, Lo yachel devaro, which is the verse that says, if somebody makes a vow, he cannot violate his words or profane his words. Hu eino mochel, he cannot sort of waive, right? And here the word of mochel, like to waive, like to annul a debt, right? He cannot sort of release from the debt, from the obligation. he cannot be meichel dvaro. Other people can get him out of his obligation. So, and that's the drasha, right? So again, he shall not means yeah, but other people can. Amar Rava. So now it says Rava.
Not any weaker than thousands of other drushes on
Okay, fine. Amar Rava. So the Gemara is going to like Shmuel's the best. L'chulu islu pir chalabar mida Shmuel. All those other drashot can be challenged except for Shmuel. It's the leis pircha that does not have a contradiction or does not have a serious challenge. Even Rebbe Lezer, it was like Rebbe Lezer's drasha about kiyafli that it says it twice. So Dilma kid Rebbe Yehuda, Shamar Mishur Rebbe Tarfon. Maybe it's like the drasha of Rebbe Yehuda in the name of Rebbe Tarfon. The tiny Rebbe Yehuda Amar Mishur Rebbe Tarfon. La'olam in echad mehem nazir. Shelo ni'nat nazir is el hafla'ah. You have a scenario. Two people are sitting on a bench, and they see a guy walking over. And Ruvain says, if that guy coming here is a nazir, then I'm a nazir. And Shimon says, if that guy coming here is not a nazir, then I'm a nazir. And then the guy comes over and says, so obviously one of these guys, Ruvain or Shimon, is going to be a nazir. But comes along Rebbe Yehuda in the name of Rebbe Tarfon and says, neither of them are a nazir. Okay, no matter what this guy is. Because since it says ki yafli, to enunciate means completely unambiguous. That at the time you take that vow, there can be no doubt about it. So here, although anyway, this is a case where you could even say that it's objectively clear which one. Somebody knows if this guy is a nazir. It's not even something that's dependent on the future, right? It's not like if it rains tomorrow, which is even more, sort of not certain. More here it's clear. This guy. It's clear as soon as one of them says it. One of them is a nazir. We just have to find out the facts. We'll have access to the facts later. But right now, there's a reality whether that guy is a nazir, which will determine which one of them is a nazir. Nevertheless, since it is not clear and explicit at the moment it's enunciated, it's not a binding vow. So that's a big chiddush. Okay, so according to that, now not everybody agrees with that, but according to that, that's why the Torah underscores ki yafli, to enunciate, meaning it has to be completely unambiguous at the time whether those words are affecting the neder or not, or affecting the nazirus or not. Okay, la'olam ein echad mehem nazir, neither of them are nazir, as opposed to other opinions that says it's obviously that one of them is. Shalonitna nazirs el hafla, nazirs has to be clearly enunciated at the time without any ambiguity about whether it's effective or not. So it's not coming to say a speech act that can annul. If it's like Rabbi Yoshua that learns it from the pasuk of Asher Nishpati Bi'api, so this is what God is saying. Ba'api Nishpati v'lo adarna bi. Yes, I took a vow in my anger and I can't reverse it. Who says it means I can reverse it? Maybe it means I can't reverse it. Okay? If it's like Rabbi Yitzchak that says Nishpati v'akaymena. So Dilma lafuke midishmur. I'm sorry, kol nediv leiv. You have to remain sort of, generous of the heart. You have to remain committed. So Dilma lafuke midishmuel, to exclude Shmuel. Damar Shmuel says Gomer b'libo tzarich sheyotzi bisfasav. So that Shmuel says that a person, even if they have a commitment to a neder in their mind or in their heart, it's not binding until it's enunciated, until it comes out of the lips. So here, Nediv Leiv says maybe sometimes even a vow in your mind is binding, even without being enunciated. So there's a whole question because everybody agrees in the vast majority of times you need to enunciate, but there might be some small areas where it's possible even without enunciating, and that's what's being discussed. I'm not getting it. Okay, so that's why. So okay. How about the drush of Chananya ben Achi Reb Yoshua that says Nishpati v'akaymena? That sounds like there's a second choice. After Nishpati, there's still a decision v'akaymena. There's still presumably a possibility not. Maybe it's teaching you something else, like Rav Gidol Amarav. Rav Gidol Amarav. How do you know that you vow in order to do a mitzvah? I have vowed, and I will keep it to observe your righteous commandments. Now, what's the chiddush of nishpa'im l'kayim et mitzvah, right? Why? So there's right. So first of all, you could think that you're not allowed to. Maybe anyway you're obligated to some degree, like a not necessary shvuah. Maybe you're already mushba v'omeid. Maybe it's not a binding shvuah because you're already obligated. Rashi says, nishpati v'akaymena, 4 lines from the bottom, from before the lines get wide. Rashi says, no, that's the first drasha. Later Rashi says, 3 lines down in the wide lines near the end of the lines. Shenishba l'chaim mitzvah, klomer mitzvah she'adam nishba l'chaim mitzvah. Today sheyimaher v'yizarez l'chaim. Not just that it's allowed, but actually you should be doing this. This is a way to push yourself and motivate yourself to do something. Okay. Tosfos says similarly. If you look at Tosfos l'chaim mitzvot, that you should actually say, like, mention God's name, take an oath in the name of God in order to motivate yourself. So that's quite interesting, this idea, because you could have just read that it's allowed or that it's binding. Here it actually reads that you're supposed to do it. Anyway, that's what the drasha is. And now one of the Taryag mitzvahs, mitzvah used a little more loosely here, but yes, you're supposed to do it. Okay, where are we? Okay, so Ella, Shmuel leisle pircha. Shmuel's idea, lo yachel dvaro, he cannot, but other people can. That there's no challenge to it. So Amar Rava v'Temer Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak kainu dami inchi. This is what people say. Tavachara pilpul lecharifta. One good sharp peppercorn is better. Mimale tzana dekari, from a basket full of bland gourds. Okay, so one good answer is right. I know. So the interesting thing is that this is said 3 times in the Gemara. Every single time, it's when Rav Yehuda says in the name of Shmuel, if I was there, I would have given a better explanation. And it's quite interesting, the 3 different times. One is about how do you know that you can break Shabbat in order to save a life. So there's all these explanations by the Tanaim. And then Shmuel says the one that we know, that's always quoted, V'chai behem v'lo she'yamos behem. Then there's this question in Megillah, and a much less sort of important halachic issue about how do you know the Megillah was written Beruach HaKodesh, where I got to tell you there, Shmuel's explanation was, I thought, not necessarily more convincing than the others, which was basically Kimu v'kiblu haYehudim, Kimu lamata masha kiblu lamata, which sort of begs the question, how do you know it was written Beruach HaKodesh? Because I'll make a drasha that says that it means that God affirmed it. Okay, but I mean, it's not how you know it from the pasuk. It's because you chose to make the drasha that way. Anyway, and this one, which is the basis of Heter Nedarim, which is the one that is generally quoted in the halachic literature of Lo Yachel Devaro. Anyway, so it's an interesting question about whether Shmuel actually said all 3, or did he just say one of them, and somehow the Gemara has 3 versions of it. But the other interesting thing is that all of these things, as Dov said before, it's like, are any of these drashot worse than any other drashot, that we get elsewhere? Like, we're not trying to say, when the Gemara says, maybe I could have used the pasuk differently, so I don't like that pasuk. Wonderful, you could say that about every drasha. Maybe I could use the pasuk differently. All we're trying to say is that it's not floating in midair, that it's got a little bit of some tiny little support. So why are those other things not good enough to be that little hair of support, and so on? But again, we also lose sight that after all of that, what the Gemara, we have all of these Tanaim that don't want to say that there is this thing that has absolutely no support, right? And that is an interesting thing, right, within like sort of Torah Shebaal Peh. Like we have some things, the category of things we have, of laws that really we're not even claiming in any way connect or derive from a verse, are normally the category we call Halach L'Moshe Misinai. And Halach L'Moshe Misinai, tends to be somewhat like standalone types of things, not things that, like in a deep fundamental way, like Heter Nedarim, really, undercut explicit biblical law. I mean, it is true you sometimes have like Halach L'Moshe Misinai that you can do certain work in the field during Tosefes Shvius period. And, assuming that Tosefes Shvius is Deoraisa. But okay, Tosefes Shvius might be Deoraisa, but it's not explicit in the Psukim. So, so to say that you've got this category that completely limits, the Torah says you must keep your vow, you must keep your vow, you must keep your vow. Oh, except if somebody comes and annuls it, and that we know based on absolutely no pasuk. Right? That's like a very threatening idea. So you do understand the pushback that you want to see this, really as somehow derived from a verse, even though we do have a category of Torah Shebaal Peh that is not derived from verses and not legislated, understood to be biblically binding, but not derived from verses. But that's again, that's Halach L'Moshe Misinai, but we wouldn't want to be putting this in that category. Yes, David.
Category. It's a really interesting problem. It actually is a case of rabbinic power.
Right.
Because you need or something
right.
to do this.
Exactly. That's a good point too. The whole.
It's not derived.
Yeah.
So it's probably not in the category of natural law.
Right.
Or things that were
right.
in society beforehand.
Shmuel does it.
And it is totally undermining of society.
Of society?
Sure. Somebody pledges $10 million.
Oh.
And then doesn't fulfill it.
Right. Which never happens in the real world, but okay. Right, but okay.
Or somebody claims that whatever.
Right, I understand.
They were the same when they signed
Right. Well,
Like, how do you run a society? You went from
right.
when you have oaths, and then you say, okay, or pledges, and you say, but if I can go to somebody who can let me out of the pledge, I'm not obligated.
Right.
To.
So most nidarim, it's a good. I hadn't thought about that because most nidarim. Well, you're right. For us, and most of it is in this concept of like pledging. Most nidarim in the Torah are between a person and God. Like or if they're a pledge to bring a korban, let's say, or they're a pledge to become a nazir or to forbid certain things on yourself, right? So, but you are right that there are those types of things as well. You're noder something to the Beis Hamikdash, and tzedakah, the Gemara says, making a commitment to tzedakah is a type of a neder. So you are right; it has both. I wasn't thinking of your category, but your category is definitely included in it. Yeah, it's a very good point.
Why does it undermine society? You have the power of the court to nullify a marriage, let's say.
Yeah, but here all you need to do is find one person or three people. You don't need, you get three of your pals. It's not like it's a centralized authority, right? If it were a centralized authority, I could say, oh well, they'll give some serious thought before they let you get out of your $1 million pledge. But the point is, no, you get three of your pals, and you have them. Yeah, but you get three hedyotos too. And you can shop around for a chacham, right? So it's not, if it were a centralized authority, there would at least be a response to that. But it's not,
You would also want to have case law standards or something.
This is
Right.
to be a measure of integrity.
You would have that if it were baked in, but Rabbi Linzer is saying this is not the case.
Yeah, I mean, look, there are some rules about what criteria have to be met in order to annul it, but you are right. It's like, yes, there's a lot of outs, right? And you're not, and there's no strong control. That's a very good question. But the other point that I thought you were making also, which is that in a way, the whole idea that this is the one thing, if you think about it, that is like the power of Torah Sheba'al Peh without a biblical verse is Heter Nedarim. In a way, it's very much like a paradigm, the model of Heter Nedarim. Because what's Heter Nedarim? Somebody is coming along, and you've got something like an existing obligation, right? And just through like my words, I'm coming along, and I'm through my role as a chacham and an authority, I'm releasing that obligation, right? In a way, isn't that what's going on here with Torah Sheba'al Peh and its relationship to Torah Shebechsav, right? The Torah says something, right? Comes along the rabbis, not even really basing themselves on a verse, and they're actually overriding it, right? So it's sort of what happens in the case when you make a neder, and the chacham, who's like the rabbinic authority, gets you out of it, right? What?
Isn't it the opposite?
What do you mean?
You have Torah Shebechsav.
Right.
Torah Sheba'al Peh comes along and tells us how we enact and fulfill the obligations of Torah Sheba'al Peh. Here you have the case that you have an obligation.
Right.
The Chacham comes along and releases you.
Right, but in a way, the rabbi, yes, most of the time that's what Torah Sheba'al Peh is doing. But first of all, it's very often it's sort of saying the psukim seem to be broad, and they're more limited than they appear. And here, and specifically, the psukim said you're held by your vow. The psukim say a person makes a vow, they're held by it. The rabbis come and say you're not held by it, right? Which is sort of paralleled, or there are ways, if you do something, you won't be held by it, which is paralleled by the actual enactment of that. Somebody takes a vow, and he's released by a chacham, right? So the Torah says you're committed by a vow, and the chachamim come and say that there's a way of releasing it. So in a way, yeah, it's a very model of the power of rabbinic power. Yes. Yeah.
Two guys sitting in a bar.
Right.
Right. And having a bar conversation. That guy is a Nazir. It's just great to bring in that kind of realization.
Okay. Hilchos Shabbos. I thought you were going to say it's a great setup for a joke. Two guys come into a bar. Okay, anyway, Hilchos Shabbos. So now Hilchos Shabbos at least have a hair to rely on. Now, yes.
Every time you have this statement by Shmuel about the Pilfel to the Harif, Rava comes in and says,
Yeah, Rava's the one.
Always Rava coming after the halacha by Shmuel.
Exactly. And Shmuel is always saying, Didi Adifa Midi
So now we're saying there is a basis then in the end.
According to those Tanaim. They don't want to accept it's a little scary, that type of a bald statement that the rabbis can just come along and assert something. Okay? By the way, to just finish this point about the what do you call it, about the hair breadth, right? In a way, that's the way Heter Nedarim works, right? Heter Nedarim works is you say to somebody, had you realized this, would you have still made your vow? And you keep on pushing until you can find that tiny little basis to say, well, actually, had I thought about this, maybe I wouldn't have made it. Oh, that's what we're going to do. We're going to find that little opening, and we're going to release you from it based on that opening, right? So that's also like paralleling, like the tiny little hint that the Torah is giving us. That's giving us now the power to say that, like, that there's this principle of heter nidarim. So again, like exactly what happens in the act of heter nidarim is paralleled in the rabbinic sort of reading or asserting that this institution exists. We find that little hair and we make that assertion. Yes. Or that little opening.
I don't think it's so surprising. Like there are other things with really intense consequences that you try to avoid finding a case for that. Like isn't that a pretty common logic?
One more time.
That like if something is so consequential, there's
right.
If you break a vow, then that's very serious.
Right.
So you'd want to avoid saying that this vow is so strict, so rigid.
You meaning so that's why the logic of heter nidarim works, because we can logically say that the person wouldn't. Are you saying that's why the rabbis want? Yeah, okay, but normally when the rabbis do that, like the Torah all the time says, right, Mos Yumas, right, has all these cases of execution in the Torah, and that's a classic example, and the rabbis come and say, no, it's only when there are two witnesses and they see it exactly the same time, and they warn the person, and he says, Afal Pichem was in Tochadei. Okay, but all of that, is done through, even though it radically changes the sort of impression one gets about what the Torah is saying in terms of the effect of those laws, it's done through a normal process of rabbinic exegesis. Now, you could say there too, it's not on the strongest supports, but better than this, which is on no support. So, that's part of the point, that this really sort of shows the power of of the rabbinic power. Okay, so now we talk about Hilchos Shabbos. So the laws of Shabbos are mountains on a hair, supported on a hair. So the Gemara says, Michtav Chsivan. What do you mean it's a mountain on a hair? It says a lot of times don't do malacha. Now, I have to say, exactly, I have to tell you, I don't really understand the question, because, it says it a lot of time, but it says the exact same things a lot of time. It says, don't do malacha, don't do malacha, don't do malacha. Wonderful. So there's a lot of hairs, but I don't understand what those malachas are, right? And there's millions of details of those malachas, malachos, and the tolados, and this and that. Right, exactly. At most, what you have is that it says, lo sevar reish b'chol moshvo seichem. Oh, and there was a person who was mekoshe shetzim. Okay. Well, I guess actually no, and to be honest, is also the other case where it says, right, b'charishu v'chatzir tishbot. So assuming that's talking about Shabbos. So at least there are a few concrete examples of what malacha is, but nevertheless, okay, maybe it's not a hair, maybe it's 5 hairs or something, but still, you have all of Maseches Shabbos. So anyway, but that's the Gemara's question. Rashi says it's written, Rashi reads it to me, there's a lot of psukim that say don't do malacha. Yeah, believe it. The Gemara says, "Lo tzmicha v'chid Rabbi Ava, like Rabbi Ava, the Amar Rabbi Ava hachover guma." Here's an example of something that does not really have only a very small hair to rely on. If somebody digs a hole on Shabbat, v'ein tzarich el afara, and all he needs is the dirt. He's not trying to dig a hole. The malacha is digging a hole, right? But because hole is a type of an issue of choresh, either for planting, or more likely bonesh, you're building a hole as a structure, to store stuff in. But this person is digging a hole, but not for the purpose of a hole. He's just digging a hole to get the dirt out. He wants dirt. So in that case, v'ein tzarich el afara, patur, he's exempt. Allah. So the Gemara says, why? First, let's figure this out. Come on, Rabbi Shimon. Is this like Rabbi Shimon? Because this is an idea of a melacha that is not needed for its own purpose, but is really for something else. You're exempt. So here, the purpose of the hole, the melacha, is defined as bona. Let's assume that building something, building a hole. Right? You got a structure that you can use, but he is not doing it for the sake of the hole. He's doing it for the sake of the dirt. So that's a melacha not done for its intended purpose, is exempt. So that only works according to Rabbi Shimon. You got to come up with something that everybody agrees on, because to make this Mishnah work. So the Gemara says no. Afilu teim Rabbi Yehuda. This would even work according to Rabbi Yehuda. Hasam etakein hachem ekalkel. When Rabbi Yehuda says that even if you did it for the wrong intent, you're still violate. That's when the result is something that actually is constructive. Here, the result is destructive. If you don't want a ditch in your yard, if you don't want a storage hole in your yard, then a hole in your yard is actually it makes your yard worse, not better, right? Depending on what the context is. But if you're not interested in it, you need the dirt, you don't want the hole. Not only you don't need, though, you don't want the hole. So in that case, even Rabbi Yehuda would say you're exempt because the effect is mekalkel. Okay, even though the exact same thing done with a different thing in mind for the purpose of the hole would actually be considered a malacha. So umay kaharin hatluyin b'sara. Why is it a mountain supported by a hair? The Gemara says melechas machshavas asra Torah. Melechas machshavas lo ksiva. Because the logic of exempting you is that the Torah says melechas machshavas, a intentional type of an act, and therefore not just you intend to do it, but like The result is something that you have planned, and you are sort of want the end result. But the problem is Melech Machshavas is written by Shabbos. It's written by the Mishkan. And we only apply it by Shabbos because of the association of Shabbos to the Mishkan, and therefore it's a big category. And it is true, the category of Meleches Machshavas gets you out of a lot of things on Shabbat, right? Like half of the kulas on Shabbat, basically. Like if you look, like when somebody asks the Shaila on Shabbos, can I do this, can I do that, or whatever, and if there's like a justification for finding a leniency, half of the time it's either because you'll do it through Amira Lagoy, have a non-Jew do it, or you'll do it through a Shinoi, right? Or you'll do it some type of a case of Einu Mitkaven and Meleches Machshavas and some type of a Patur like this. So it's a huge category of exemption, and it's not clear in any biblical verse. It's based on this association to the Mishkan. But again, I find this Gemara very unsatisfying, because to me the bigger mountain that Hilchos Shabbos rests, is the whole 39 melachot with all of the toladot and all of that, which is very not clear in the Torah. And the linking here, this type of an idea that you're only obligated if you actually were sort of intending for this type of a result, and not if not. Okay, I'm not saying that it's pashut, but it's not like such a huge chiddush that we should sort of somehow say that the act is defined when it's in sync with your intention. And anyway, big deal that it's learned out from the Mishkan. So we learned tons of halachot from associations of one category to another category. Why all of a sudden is Snarim Matluyim Basara? Because it's learned out from the Mishkan. So I really don't understand what the problem of the Gemara was here, and why this somehow was a more satisfying answer. But yes,
This happens all the time.
yes,
Nancy told me to sweep on Shabbos. I said I didn't want to sweep. She
right.
said sweep anyway. I said I'm not going to do it mindlessly. She said it'll make the house look nice. So I said it's a tikkun.
There you go. All right. That's using your learning for a good purpose. Okay, so the Gemara says Hagigah. So the Gemara says Michtav.
Taking out the garbage.
Finally, okay, Hagigah. Finally, what this is doing in our Masechet. Again, why it's here, who knows? Hagigah. Michtav Ksiva. Now, forget, if anything, like the Torah says, V'chagosem so chag la Hashem shivat yamim. And again, you could say that means just celebrate, which is what the Gemara is going to say, but it's reasonable that to interpret it to mean to bring a korban as a means of celebrating. And the actual number of halachot about a Hagigah are very tiny. What halachos do we have about Hagigah? What's considered tashlumim? What's the minimum amount, although that might be a derabanan? I mean, how many halachas do we have about Hagigah? If you're blind, right, and learning it out from Re'iyah, which the Gemara, by the way, never spelled out how it knows to learn the exemptions of Re'iyah to Hagigah. But okay, it's not a large number of halachot. Maybe a little hill based on a Sa'ara, but I don't know if it's a mountain. Anyway, so let's see what the Gemara says. So the Gemara says like this: Michtav Ksiva. I mean, come on, that's explicit verse. It's not just a hair. No, lo tzricha lichid amar Rav Papa Rabbi, like Rav Papa says to Rabbi, Nimai dahai v'chagosem chag l'Hashem zvicha. How do you know when it says celebrate a holiday to God? That means slaughtering sacrifices. Maybe it just means to have a holiday, to have a lot of rejoicing, and there was much rejoicing. So, no, it can't be, because it says Moshe says to Paro, "V'yachogu li bamidbar." So let them have a celebration to me. Because all Moshe is saying is we want to go out and celebrate, we want to go out and party. No, we want to bring a chag to God, means sacrifices. No, maybe that is what he was saying. Have a celebration for God. Taksiv. You'll give us, sacrifices. So clearly, the chag is a sacrifice. So, all right. Maybe this is what God was saying. Interesting guy, because also Moshe was saying, yes, eat and drink and have a celebration. So it's not exactly clear how that answers it, but Rashi basically says is, well, the celebration could obviously mean eat meat, but it doesn't necessarily mean sacrifices. And when Moshe is saying Titem Yadenu Zvachim Ve'olot, Zevach does not have to mean a sacrifice. Zevach can mean something to slaughter. So, Olah, okay, so there was Olot, but that's not what the Hagigah is. So that's not relevant to our point. Okay, so anyway, maybe it just means a celebration with meat. Maybe it doesn't mean a sacrifice. So the Gemara says no. Lo sakadaitich. The verse says, "V'lo yalin chelev chagiyad boker." The fat of my chag shall not sleep over till the next morning when you bring the sacrifice. So clearly a chag is a type of a sacrifice. The chogahu, if you think that chag means just a celebration, tarba l'chag izle, does a celebration have fat? So what do you mean the fat of my celebration? That wouldn't make sense. It's the fat of my sacrifice. So the Gemara says, no. Maybe this is what the Torah is saying. Fats of sacrifices that are brought during the Chag. Lo yalin, don't let them sleep over. So whatever sacrifices you bring over Yontif and Chol HaMoed, you can't let it, the fat not be burnt on the altar overnight, and that the fat would sort of stay off the altar till the next morning. But it doesn't mean that the Chag is the name of a sacrifice. It just means sacrifices brought, whatever sacrifices you bring during the Chag.
This is the one halacha that's tluya b'sa'ara. You can't have the fat.
No. But no, the Tluya B'Sara is the obligation of Hagigah. What we're trying to argue is that it's not totally B'Sara, because Hagigah, just by context and looking at other verses, means a korban.
Right, so why is the Lord resisting that?
Because it's challenging that argument that it's totally b'sara. What do you mean it's totally b'sara? It says shivas yamim tachogu or vasita chag shavuot, and we'll see by other psukim that a chag is a korban.
No, I know, but then
so that's not totally.
It doesn't mean that. How come we're just going the other way?
Because it's trying to support the idea that it's totally b'sara. Okay, so that's the issue. Can you really claim that the Hagigah is totally b'sara? So let's take a look. So maybe it is, because chag might not have meant there a korban. It might mean korbanot brought during the chag, but chag might mean the holiday. So the Gemara says like this: Elameata hababis man chag hutelo yoli. No. The verse can't mean that, because then what would it be saying? Sacrifices brought during the chag, the fat can't sort of sleep over. You have to burn the fat overnight. But other sacrifices you can let the fat stay overnight. But says called the Laila Boker Ksiv, but says by the Ola that all the night until the morning is when it should be burnt. So obviously all sacrifices, the fat has to be burnt at night and not stay over till the next morning. So obviously the verse would not just mean, sacrifices of the Chag have a special status. So the Gemara says, no, Dilma Imiyahu, if it was just that verse by the Ola, Havaminahu La say that's a positive mitzvah, that you have to burn it in the before morning. Kazarachmana Hai Lilav. But then it says lo yalin chaylev chagi, to say there's also a negative prohibition to let the fat stay over. But again, maybe it's only talking not about chag as a korban chagiga, but korbanos brought during the holiday. So the Gemara says lulav ksiv kara charina. No, there's another verse. Lo yalin min basar shechizbach be'erev biyom harishon laboker. Do not leave over from the meat that you slaughter at the night until the next morning. So you see, in general, there are negative prohibitions to let the fat or the meat stay over till the next morning. So the Gemara says, this chaylev chagi can't just generally mean general sacrifices, because there are psukim about it. It must mean there's a specific sacrifice called a chagigah. Where it says no, v'diyam alav lav b'shnei lavim v'asei. Even so, I'll argue that you get two negative prohibitions. But again, chaylev chagi might not mean the korban chagigah. It could just mean generic sacrifices brought when you bring him during the holiday. Ella, says the Gemara, fine. Asya midbar. So you're right. From the verse Hagigah, from the verse Chaylev Chagi, you could not have necessarily learned that it was a sacrifice. Although let's face it, that's a pretty good proof that the fat of a chag means that the chag is a sacrifice. But the Gemara is conceding that even though that maybe it's not, maybe it would have meant more generic fats of sacrifices during a chag. But I'll show you that the word chag means a sacrifice from the following Gzeira Shava. Ksiv hacha vayachogu li bamidbar. Celebrate for me in the midbar. Moshe says to Paro. The Ksiv hasam, and it says over there in Amos, Hazvachimu mincha higashtem li bamidbar. Have you brought for me, right, grain offerings and meat sacrifices in the wilderness? So malahalan zvachim. The same way there it's zvachim. It's funny. Paro also said zvachim ve'olot, but here we assume that means sacrifices. Afkan zvachim. All right, so somehow from this connection to this other verse of Midbar, we learn out that we're talking about that it's a sacrifice. Okay, so the Gemara says, so why is it rested on a hair? You now have learned out that the Hagigah means a sacrifice. So based on either Chaylev Chagi or this connection to this verse in Amos, so the Gemara says, no, That's not a real derivation because the verse in Amos is only the Nevi'im or
You do
Ketuvim.
that all the time.
I know we do it all the time, but we come up
I
with.
complain about it all the time.
All right. Anyway, in principle, we don't do it, even if we violate it. So therefore, it's not really a clear derivation. Now again, and maybe this is the same point about Shabbat, which is that I still don't understand why it's a har, meaning it might be a sarah, but I'm not sure why it's a har. There's not a lot of halachot, and actually it says halachot merubot umikra muat, right? Does it say that? Halachot merubot, what does it say in the Mishnah? Shemikra muat halachot merubot. So the Gemara does not seem to be bothered about the halachot merubot part. It seems to be bothered about the mikra muat, and therefore, both by like Shabbat and Hagigah, it says even if there's a lot that we learned out from, at least we got a pasuk to begin with. Right, and that seems to be going back to the other problem I had before by Shabbat. Yes, all it says is lo taseh melacha, and we learned out a huge mountain. But the Gemara says, but if you got an explicit pasuk to begin with, we're not going to call that a se'ara. That's an explicit pasuk, even though what you learn out is enormous based on that. So when we have an explicit pasuk by Shabbat, don't do melacha. So the answer is no. But the category of meleches machsheves is a category not based on a pasuk by Shabbat. It's based on a pasuk in the Mishkan. So the original source of it is not a pasuk by Shabbat. So here too by Hagigah is saying the same. Here we might not have a har at all, but at least we got a pasuk. It says Hagigah, and the Gemara says no, because the actual pasuk is not really so clear that it's about a korban. So if you don't really start from an explicit verse, that allows us to call this a se'ara. Dov, you had a question.
Yeah, it's not simple to what you're saying, but I think it's not that so much that it's explicit or not explicit, that it's subject to interpretation, and the rabbi seized on that and determined they determine the idea is that the rabbis determine what the interpretation is.
Right.
So, more or less.
But that's everything. That's not just these handful.
That was everything, from what Malachas Gurubas.
I understand, but the point of the Mishnah seems to be creating three categories. Heter Nedarim have nothing to rely on. Shabbos, Me'ila, Hagigah have our mountains on a hair. And then the other things, dinim, avoda, taras, tumas, those are well supported, right? So it's like creating this, this taxonomy or this categorization, right?
So
what?
So what?
I think the so what is the last line. Hein ve'hen gufei Torah. Like it's all equally, don't give more weight to the last category and less to the other. We acknowledge that there are things that are more clearly derived and things that are less clearly derived, and it's all equally from, divinely binding in Torah, and it's all equal. Don't give them different weights.
And I wonder if there's a play on words here. So, if you read the machine, the sha'er is to estimate value of, determine value of something.
Interesting. Yes.
Quick question, just earlier you usually say is usually called divrei Kabbalah. When is certain things usually called divrei Nevi'im?
No. Actually, that's a very new common term that the Torah says is divrei Kabbalah one, especially when it's referring to it and it's sort of in the way that it does not have the same legal sense. So why it's called divrei Kabbalah is another discussion. But yeah, so I don't want to get into it. There's a whole interesting discussion about that. But anyway, okay, mi'ilot. It does not mean mysticism. Okay.
Based on what you said.
Yes.
Talking about the equal value of the three categories.
Right.
Intuitively should be different.
Right.
Right. It harkens back to when they were giving categories of worthy venture.
Uh-huh.
Right. The learning of Torah is the highest venture. The learning of Gemara is the highest
Right.
venture.
Uh-huh.
Right. And
Right.
everything else. And Mikra also is.
Right. It's like the law. Right. Mida ve'no mida. Right.
Which you would think. Yeah.
Right. It's a good point. Right. It's true. That's sort of. It exactly does parallel the weighting towards Torah Shebaal Peh, regardless of how much sort of Torah Shebaal supports it. That's the question, because Hagigah is one of the things mentioned. But of course, Shabbos, there's other things that are more obviously in this category. The Nedarim is more obviously. Let's talk about it in Nedarim. That's really like Har Matzluim B'Sara, right? But it's in Nazir. I have to check how it appears in Nazir. But anyway, yeah, I don't know why. And it's going to allow the Gemara in the next parak to get into some of its very, like some of the stuff that Hagigah is well known for. They're talking about like Maaseh Merkava and Maaseh Bereshis and so on. Also sort of seems to be a derivation of this digression that we start in this Mishnah. So you got me. I'm sure there's some theories about this. Let's go further. Mi'ilot. Okay, so mi'ilot is another thing of harim atluim b'sa'ara, and mi'ila is the misuse of hekdesh. Okay, now on the one hand, right, the category of mi'ila is written explicitly in the Torah. On the other hand, so it's not much of a sa'ara. On the other hand, it is a huge har, as the Gemara will say. There's an enormous amount of laws, and not only there are an enormous amount of laws, as the Gemara is going to spell out, a lot of the laws are actually seem arbitrary and counterintuitive. Okay, and that's certainly true about the category of mi'ilah, and that's what the Gemara will explore. But why exactly it's a sa'ar, we'll see. So let's take a look what the Gemara says. Mi'ilot, the Gemara says, Michlev Tzivan. Come on, there are verses about not misusing hekdesh. It's not a sa'ar. So, Amar Rami Bar Chama, no. The point of this, that there's only a hair, is for the following law of mi'ilah. If the shliach does what he was sent to do, the house owner has done mi'ilah, has trespassed, and if he does not do what he was sent to do, then the shliach. So what's the scenario? Scenario is, I actually go into my wallet to take out some money, and I forgot that the money in my wallet is actually hekdesh money. I had sanctified it, I donated it to the Beis HaMikdash, I forgot to take it out of my wallet, or I took the wrong wallet, and I took some money, and I go ahead and I give Michael $100, and I say, or $20, I said, Michael, go get me some apples and bananas. Okay, and I give him the $20, which is hekdesh, which I didn't realize, because you can only do mi'ilah in the sense of being a korban mi'ilah, if it's b'shogeg. It's another interesting halacha. You can actually violate b'mezi, but you only bring a korban if it's b'shogeg, and so on. And a whole series of the halachot of mi'ilah depend on the shogeg scenario. So I unawares give this to Michael. If Michael goes ahead and buys the apples and bananas, he's asa shlichuto, then I was moel. Because he did what I sent him to do. He was doing it. He was essentially my arm, my agent. So it's like I spent the hekdesh money because he was just an extension of me. If, however, he says, those apples and bananas don't look any good, I'm going to instead get some like oranges and pineapples, and he does that, then he was moel because he's no longer an extension of me, and he's the one spending the hekdesh money. Okay, that's the halacha. So let's take a look. So the Gemara says, that's the halacha. So why is that such a hair? Why is that not like just a reasonable thing to say? So the Gemara says, but if Michael did what he was sent to do, why should I be moel? Why should can this one sin and the other one be held responsible? So Michael was the one that spent the money. How come I'm the one that has transgressed? So that's why it's a mountain on a hair's breadth, because now what's interesting here is that the Gemara is making the hair's breadth that logically it's a hair's, there's not a strong logic to rely on, right? Until now it would have been that there's not a verse to rely on. Here there's not a strong logic to rely on. So the Gemara says, Amarava, umay kusha, why is that difficult to understand that? We learn mi'ilah in certain ways from truma. Now truma, I can make Michael, my agent, to separate truma for me. So mahasam shlucha shaladam kamoso, the same way there he can separate truma for me. Avkan shlucha shaladam kamoso, here, where he goes ahead and spends the money, he's like me, and therefore, if he does what I said him to do, it's my transgression. Now, obviously, there's a difference, because the taking of truma is a legal act, and I can legally empower him to do the act, whereas the sense of violation and transgression and being liable for a transgression, right? But that's something that the Gemara says. When do we ever have the idea that somebody else sins and you're the one held liable? But the Gemara's answer might seem to be, okay, maybe it's bizarre, but we at least have a basis for it. The basis is the model of truma. And even though normally we don't, you could also go further and say the reason I can make Michael a shaliach to take the truma is because the focus is less on the act and more on the end result, to have the actual truma taken, and therefore it doesn't really matter, does he take it or do I take it? And the same here by the spending of the money. Although he is the one spending the money, I was the one who caused the money to be misspent, and therefore I am the one that really did the violation, because the causing of it to be misspent, right? It's not like he violated Shabbat and I'm chayiv. Like I might have misled him to violate Shabbat, but what focuses there was the act that was done. Here the focus is less the act. Giving money to a storekeeper is an act of milah. No, it was the context and the result of it having been misspent and having been, misused. Anyway, so that's a way of understanding why he can do it and it still be seen as mine. But the Gemara. No, I don't know when he does it. Oh, in the truma, when he separates truma, yes. But in the me'ilah case, no, I didn't even realize it was. I took the money accidentally. So we're all making mistakes.
Then the shliach will be moel.
if I told you that it was money, then totally you're on your own. Yeah, then yeah, absolutely.
Even if you said this, but I want you to do that.
Yeah, because then you're consciously doing something you know you shouldn't be doing. What? When he misuses it, because then he's no longer an extension of me. Meaning, I might have been, I might have like misled him, but in the end, what he's doing is not seen as my acting done through him anymore. He's doing his own thing. He's buying pineapples and oranges.
Let's say it wasn't. But let's say it was your money. You said to the store to buy apples. And he goes and he uses his discretion. He says, "Not good. I'm going to buy the pineapples."
Right.
Instead.
Right.
Is he liable to you in that case?
To pay me back the money? Yeah, I mean, in that case,
Well,
I mean,
the
Gemara, what?
Unless you're happy with it.
Well, yeah, I mean, so the Gemara discusses scenarios like that, but the basic answer is yes. The basic answer, so, yeah. Okay, so anyway, so let's take a look. So the Gemara says, Elam Rava, okay, so that case actually makes sense. Here's what we need it for. Nizkar balabayis below nizkar shaliach. Here's where it gets really like wild. Michael's there. He's going and he's buying the apples and oranges. He's doing the apples and bananas. He's doing exactly what I told him to do. But before he actually buys them, here he is in the store, and I say, "Oh my gosh, I just sent Michael with that money. That was hektish money." So as soon as I realize that it's hektish money and I stop being a shogeg and I realize it, then I don't want him to do it anymore. But I can't there was no cell phones. I couldn't get the message to him. Okay? So he is no longer, I don't want him to be my shaliach anymore because I realized it was a mistake, so he's no longer my shaliach. And now he has transgressed, even though he's doing exactly what I asked him to do. Even though he didn't know. Shaliach mal. Right? Shaliach mal. So that the Gemara says in a very beautiful way. Shaliach Anya, this poor Shaliach, my Kovid, what did he do wrong? He did exactly what I told him to do. He didn't know. He was ignorant. I woke up and I realized, and now he's Moel. So Hainu Karim Atliyim Basara. That's the mountain on a hair. So Amar Ravashi, my kusha, why is that difficult? Maybe it's just like the normal example. A normal example is I accidentally, if I stuck my hand in my pocket and took the wrong money and accidentally misused hektish funds, I would do me'ila, even though it was, oh, poor me, I didn't know. Okay, I didn't know. It doesn't matter. I'm still a shogeg, so fine. I don't, I made a mistake, but I still did me'ila. Now, the obvious difference here is not just that Michael didn't know. But Michael had no responsibility to know, right? When I took the wrong money, I should have known which was my hektish money and which was my non. Michael had absolutely no responsibility to know, and he's still being held liable. But the Gemara is still saying it's not crazy. It's possible to transgress even in ignorance. So, Ella...
That's not a big thing.
Not at all. Ella Ravashi, so says Ravashi, Lo nitzucha elochidit nan. Natal eveno kora shel hekdesh. If somebody takes a beam or a stone belonging to hekdesh, harei lo ma'al. I took it. I didn't do meila. But nasna lechavero. If I gave it now to Michael, here, Michael, here's a beam. I know you're building a house. I'm sure you can use this beam. Hu ma'al v'chavero lo ma'al. I was moel because by giving it to Michael, I was taking it away from hekdesh. Michael now will not be moel because once this thing has been taken away from hekdesh, actually an interesting aspect of hilchos meila is that it stops being hekdesh. Okay, so now the Gemara says, fine, so Michael is off either way. But michti, let's take a look, says the Gemara. Mishkol shakle. In both cases, I took the beam, right? I took it out of Hekdesh's storehouse. Once I took it out of Hekdesh's storehouse and brought it to my house, I haven't done anything wrong. I give it to somebody, I transgress. Why did I do something wrong when I took it out of their storehouse? So, malihu, mali chavera. What do I care if you took it to your house or if you gave it to your friend? Either way, you took it from Hekdesh. That's why it's a mountain on a hair. Again, notice all of these are because it doesn't make logical sense. We're no longer worried about verses. So the Gemara says, Umay kusha, why is that difficult? Yom Shmuel, Damar Shmuel. Shmuel was so bothered with the logic of that case that he made it a special case. And the case was, I'm the temple treasurer. I'm the overseer of the beams and the stones of Hekdesh. So even if I'm moving them around, wherever I'm moving them, they're considered to be in Hekdesh's control, right? Even if I take it to my house, which is a funny thing, you can say, okay, you know what? Sometimes you take supplies. If you're the guy in charge, you take the supplies home and you store it so things can move around. And so even though my intention might have been to steal, which is fascinating, since in my role I am the Gizbar, there's nowhere it can be with me that it's considered out of Hekdesh's control.
It's a great defense for embezzlement.
Exactly.
Put it on my account so I can pay more close attention.
Exactly. There you go. Exactly. Wherever it is, it's in the Hektish's Rishus. And therefore, only when I pay it out, give it to somebody else, can I actually be seen as having taken it away from Hektish. So we will continue with this tomorrow to figure out what is the case by Me'ilah that doesn't make sense, that the Gemara can therefore call Harim Hatluyim B'Sara.
Rabbi Linzer,
Yes.
in Kedushin, where the Gemara establishes the